When you look at a map of the world, Australia looks like, it looks like the ultimate geographic fortress.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally isolated.
Right. It is this massive island continent surrounded by seemingly endless oceans.
Mm-hmm.
And the tyranny of distance meant that the rest of the world's problems were historically, a world away.
Yeah, but that distance doesn't really protect them anymore.
Exactly. Because when you start digging into the geopolitics of the 21st century, that impenetrable fortress looks a lot more like a very exposed, very frayed tightrope.
It's an incredibly precarious position. I mean, strategists actually refer to it as the Canberra dilemma.
The Canberra dilemma.
Right. And the core of that dilemma is this paradox that is honestly completely unique on the global stage. Basically, Australia relies almost entirely on the United States for its national security, but
it relies almost entirely on China for its economic prosperity.
Exactly. It relies on China for its economy.
Yeah.
It's a massive contradiction.
It's the ultimate rock in a hard place. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are sifting through a massive stack of research today. Geopolitical analyses, trade data, defense strategies.
A lot of heavy material.
Yeah, a ton of it. And the mission today is to explore what actually happens if Australia gets caught in a superpower collision between those two giants.
And look, before we get too deep into this, I do want to establish some ground rules for you listening. We are dealing with some heavily polarized defense strategies today and, fiercely competing global viewpoints.
Yeah, very politically charged stuff.
Right. So our goal here isn't to take a side on Washington versus Beijing or, dictate who is right or wrong in this grand strategic game. We are just looking impartially at the raw data of Australia's dilemma. What actually happens if these two titans collide?
And the stakes here go way beyond just submarines and trade tariffs. This is really a story about diplomatic high-wire acts.
It's about fear and greed.
Yeah. And how a nation's geography can transform, like overnight, from its greatest shield into its absolute biggest vulnerability.
Totally. And to understand the trap that Australia finds itself in today, we really have to look at how it historically managed its isolation.
Right, because we all know Australia kind of outsourced its security in the past.
Yeah, they relied heavily on the British Empire. Up until World War II, the British Royal Navy basically provided the security umbrella.
But that strategy violently collapsed, right, in 1942?
Exactly. At 1942, the fall of Singapore. The Japanese military advanced, the supposed British fortress fell, and the realization hit Canberra really hard.
That Britain could no longer defend its distant dominions.
Right. It was a psychological earthquake for them. It forced this rapid strategic realignment. They pivoted away from the British Empire and locked themselves firmly into the U.S. security orbit.
Which was formalized by the ANZ-US Treaty, right, in 1951?
Yep, the ANZ-US Treaty. And for a long time, that was a perfectly neat, highly functional arrangement.
Well, right up until the economic realities of the 21st century kicked in.
Yeah, that's when things get complicated.
Because China becomes this unstoppable global economic powerhouse. And Australia, sitting on these vast reserves of natural resources, just happily feeds that staggering growth.
Which creates a really bizarre dynamic.
Bizarre is putting it mildly. I mean, reading through the sources, it sounds like we're talking about moving out of your parents' house, hiring a very tough bodyguard for protection, but then taking a full-time job at a company that your bodyguard is actively trying to dismantle.
That is a brilliant analogy.
How does any nation think that strategy ends well? Like, what was the plan?
Well, the underlying assumption in Canberra was that they would never actually be forced to choose. The research characterizes this era of Australian foreign policy as being driven by, and this is a direct concept pulled from former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, by fear and greed.
Fear and greed.
Right. So the greed element was this massive rush to conclude lucrative trade deals, aiming to capitalize on China's rise before Beijing became too dominant to negotiate with on equal terms.
Okay, and the fear, presumably, is the anxiety over just how powerful that same customer was becoming militarily right in their own backyard.
Exactly the tension they were trying to navigate. So Australia practiced what analysts call strategic hedging.
Meaning they play both sides.
Pretty much. They deepened their security ties with the U.S. military while simultaneously embedding their economy deep into China's industrial machine.
And as long as Washington and Beijing tolerated each other, this hedging strategy was highly profitable.
Extremely profitable and relatively low friction.
But the data we're looking at today shows the era of hedging is officially dead. The temperature has just gone way up.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, a logical assumption for anyone listening would be, well, since the hedging era is over, why doesn't Australia just economically decouple from China?
Just pull the plug.
Yeah. Pull the plug and start trading exclusively with friendly, allied nations. Problem solved, right?
Yeah, if only it were that simple. The asymmetry in the trade data makes decoupling a virtual impossibility.
Staggering numbers here.
They really are. Look at the 2024 fiscal year. Australia generated $212 billion from Asian exports.
Okay.
Compare that to the U.S. market, which accounted for a mere $37 billion.
Wow. 37 billion versus 212.
And it gets more specific. Two-way trade with China specifically sits at $246.3 billion. That is 3.4 times larger than their entire trade volume with the United States.
But wait, hasn't this decoupling theory already been put to a real-world stress test?
You're talking about 2020.
Yeah, around 2020. Relations took a massive nosedive when Australia called for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, right?
Yeah.
And China retaliated with a massive economic coercion campaign.
They absolutely pulled the economic levers. China slapped an 80% tariff on Australian barley. They heavily targeted beef, wine, and coal.
And the diplomatic rhetoric was incredibly aggressive, too, according to the sources.
Extremely. You had a Chinese embassy official actually handing a journalist a list of 14 grievances.
14 grievances?
Yeah, complaining about things like Australian foreign investment laws and 5G network bans. And a Chinese state media editor even compared Australia to chewing gum stuck on the sole of China's shoes.
Jeez. Chewing gum on the shoe.
Oh.
So they were squeezed really hard. But the sources note that this coercion campaign actually failed to crush the Australian economy.
It did fail, yes.
So if China was actively trying to punish them and Australia survived, doesn't that prove that decoupling is actually possible? I mean, they survived the pressure test.
Well, they survived the pressure test because of what we can call the iron ore shield.
The iron ore shield. Explain that.
Notice what China didn't heavily target during that whole coercion campaign. Iron ore. China's entire economic engine, its massive infrastructure projects and real estate development, it requires staggering amounts of steel.
And to make that steel, they need iron ore.
Exactly. And Australia supplies a massive 82% of China's iron ore imports.
82%. So China couldn't cut off the iron without basically paralyzing its own industrial growth.
Right. The dependency goes both ways. It's mutual.
It's mutually assured.
And the research goes much deeper into the mechanics of this, using something called computable general equilibrium, or CGE, modeling.
CGE modeling. What does that actually track?
Well, CGE modeling doesn't just look at direct shipping lanes between two countries. It tracks the raw components as they flow through the entire interconnected global web.
So walk us through how that contagion actually works in the model.
Sure. So when economists run the CGE models on a hypothetical total trade embargo between Australia and China, the models show catastrophic GDP loss for both nations, which is expected.
Right, that makes sense.
But the shockwave travels down the entire global assembly line. The CGE modeling reveals it would trigger a net GDP contraction for third-party countries, like ASEAN nations and India.
Wait, really? You would think India or Vietnam would win big in that scenario by stepping in to replace China's manufacturing output.
You would think so, but they can't step in because they rely on the upstream materials.
Ah, I see.
If Australia stops sending iron, China stops making steel. If China stops exporting steel, Vietnam can't get the affordable steel components they need to build the consumer goods they export to Europe or the U.S.
So the global supply chain is just so deeply integrated that a shock at the raw material level pulls literally everyone down.
Exactly. Decoupling isn't just difficult for Australia. It is mutually assured economic destruction.
Okay, well, that makes the economic reality very clear. Australia absolutely must stay tied to China.
Right.
But their military posture is screaming the exact opposite. They're moving away from managed competition and into what analysts call hard balancing, alongside the United States.
Yeah, they are fully committing militarily. And the most visible symbol of that hard balancing is the AUKUS Pact.
AUKUS.
Right. It's a staggering $368 billion agreement with the U.S. and the U.K. to acquire nuclear-powered submarines by 2075.
But the sources say the physical subs are only a fraction of the shift.
Exactly. Australia is aggressively expanding U.S. access to its military bases. You have RAF-based Tyndall in the north being upgraded to host up to 6 U.S. B-52 bombers.
Wow.
And Naval Base HMAS Sterling in the West is expanding to support rotational deployments of U.S. and U.K. nuclear submarines.
Okay, let me challenge the logic on that.
Sure.
The political talking point is always that hosting these massive U.S. military assets serves as deterrence. Having a big stick keeps the peace.
That's the theory.
But by hosting B-52s and nuclear submarines, isn't Australia essentially buying an umbrella that acts as a lightning rod? Does integrating this deeply into the U.S. military machine actually make them safer?
The military analysis in the sources tackles that exact concern. And honestly, the mechanics of how this works are incredibly sobering.
How so?
Well, Australian bases are no longer just hosting American troops. They are heavily integrated into U.S. war planning and intelligence operations.
Okay, give us an example.
Take the secretive Pine Gap Intelligence Facility in the Australian outback. Pine Gap isn't just a passive listening post. It is crucial for locating targets, intercepting communications, and transmitting data to U.S. nuclear-armed ships and bombers.
So it's literally the eyes and ears of the U.S. military in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes. Now, apply that to Chinese military doctrine. Their doctrine heavily favors preemptive strikes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If a major conflict breaks out, the strategy is to blind the enemy in the opening hours by taking out command, control, and intelligence structures.
And because Australia hosts the critical nervous system of the U.S. military in the region,
its geography no longer provides a buffer.
the fortress walls aren't just breached. They are practically painted with the target.
The sources are explicit about this mechanism. In a major U.S.-China conflict, Australia wouldn't even need to be physically invaded to suffer a devastating defeat.
Right, because their infrastructure gets hit immediately.
Exactly. Its ports, its fuel lines, its integrated military bases, they would be targeted in the opening hours. By hosting these assets, they have traded their historical geographic isolation for a spot directly on the nuclear front line.
And the flashpoint for that theoretical lightning rod is obviously Taiwan. The sources use Taiwan as the ultimate stress test for this entire dilemma.
And the economic exposure around a Taiwan scenario is terrifying for Australia. 27% of Australia's global exports pass directly through the Taiwan Strait.
27%. And isn't it true that a massive portion of that leads from a single highly vulnerable bottleneck?
Yes. Port Hedland in Western Australia, 85% of the iron ore carriers that keep the Australian economy afloat depart from Port Hedland and head straight through that corridor.
So if a blockade or kinetic conflict happens over Taiwan, that route is just choked off.
Completely. The economic lifeblood simply stops flowing.
Which brings up a really critical timeline problem. The AUKUS Pact promises nuclear submarines to protect those routes, but the text quotes former Prime Minister Paul Keating, offering a pretty brutal assessment.
Yeah, it's a famous quote now.
He said that relying on 8 nuclear submarines by 2075 to deter China today is like throwing a handful of toothpicks at the mountain.
Right.
Because if the intelligence community's timeline for a potential Taiwan conflict is closer to 2027, Australia's actual military contribution in terms of raw combat power is incredibly limited.
Their kinetic combat power would be limited, yes, but their contribution of intelligence, logistics, and basing would be indispensable to the United States.
Which again circles back to why they become an immediate target in the 2027 scenario.
Long before those submarines ever touch the water.
But AUKUS, and really this entire hard balancing strategy, seems to assume that the United States will always be there to answer the phone.
And that is becoming a very big assumption.
Yeah, looking at the research on recent U.S. administrations, that unshakable American reliability is starting to look like a massive gamble.
The sources actually refer to the current state of U.S.-China tensions as undersea earthquakes. You never really know when the geopolitical tsunami is going to hit the shore.
Right.
For 70 years, under the ANZUS Treaty, Australia assumed the U.S. was a stable, predictable protector. But we've seen the Trump shock fundamentally alter how alliances are viewed in Washington.
It's become transactional.
Exactly.
The U.S. has applied tariffs on its own allies, torn up trade agreements, and aggressively demanded higher defense spending from partners,
betting their entire national survival on a Washington political climate that can drastically shift every 4 years. That is an unprecedented risk for Canberra.
So they are being squeezed by a rising, assertive China on one side.
And an increasingly unpredictable, demanding United States on the other.
Okay, let's play this out. If playing along with the U.S. means betting the house on an unpredictable ally while painting a giant bullseye on your own continent,
yeah,
and Playing along with China means abandoning democratic values, and your security guarantor, why play the game at all?
That's the big question.
Why doesn't Australia just pull out of the military pacts, refuse to host foreign bombers, and, play Switzerland? Just trade with everyone and align with no one. It worked perfectly well for non-aligned nations during the Cold War.
It's a very tempting thought. But the geopolitical environment today makes the illusion of neutrality incredibly dangerous.
Why dangerous?
The sources explicitly reject it because strategic ambiguity is dead in the Indo-Pacific.
But why is it dead? Like, if you genuinely commit to neutrality, neither side has a reason to attack you, right?
Well, it's because of how deeply entrenched the existing architecture is.
Yeah.
If Australia suddenly tries to be neutral, Washington interprets that as an immediate betrayal of a 70-year alliance.
So you lose the U.S. security umbrella overnight.
Meanwhile, Beijing looks at the deep integration that already exists, the intelligence sharing, the legacy infrastructure, at places like Pine Gap.
And they remain deeply suspicious.
Exactly. Beijing won't believe the neutrality is real. So by trying to appease both, Australia loses the protection of Washington while remaining a prime target for Beijing.
They strip away their armor, but keep the target on their back.
Exactly.
So if neutrality is a death sentence and picking a side is a trap, what is the actual alternative proposed in the research? Is there a secret third door here?
There is, actually. The sources point to a strategy called multilateral balancing, or the formation of middle power coalitions.
Middle power coalition.
Right. The premise is that Australia doesn't have to face this binary choice completely alone. Instead of relying solely on the U.S. muscle to counter China, Australia can build deeper, highly institutionalized networks with other nations facing the exact same superpower pressures.
Yeah. So finding strength in a pack rather than hiding behind the biggest kid on the playground.
Precisely. We are talking about binding agreements with nations like Japan, India, Indonesia, and Canada.
Okay, the text actually gives a really fascinating specific example of how the mechanics of this work in reality. The March 2026 agreement between Australia and Canada.
Yes.
And that was focused entirely on critical mineral supply chains, right?
That agreement is the perfect illustration of middle power agency. Mining a critical mineral is only step one. Processing it into a usable component is incredibly capital intensive, and China currently holds a massive global monopoly on that processing capability.
Right, so if Australia tries to build a processing industry alone, China can just flood the market, tank the prices, and bankrupt the Australian facilities.
Exactly the mechanism of coercion we saw before. But under the 2026 agreement, Australia and Canada pool their resources. They coordinate their supply chains, they share the massive capital costs of building processing facilities, and they guarantee a market for each other's refined minerals.
Wow. So by doing this together, they basically bypass China's processing monopoly without requiring the United States to lead or fund the charge.
Exactly. They create an alternative supply chain that neither superpower can easily weaponize against them.
It reduces their vulnerability to asymmetric pressure.
It's a way of reclaiming real strategic independence in a world that is aggressively trying to force everyone into rigid, Cold War-style blocks.
Let's pull all these threads together for you, the listener. We started by talking about Australia's geographic dilemma, but this isn't just an isolated story about an island nation on the other side of the world.
No, not at all.
This is a real-time case study of how the global world order is fracturing. The interconnected supply chains that deliver goods to your doorstep, the microchips in your devices, the economic stability of the entire Indo-Pacific. It all rests heavily on how countries like Australia navigate this impossible squeeze between Washington and Beijing.
And ultimately, it forces a profound reckoning of national identity, which is the philosophical question running through all of these sources.
Right.
As the geopolitical tectonic plates shift, what actually is Australia? Is it primarily a Western nation irrevocably bound by history, culture, and defense ties to the U.S. and Europe? Or is it an Indo-Pacific nation, fundamentally bound by its geography and its economic survival to Asia?
The ultimate question is whether any nation can successfully be both in the 21st century.
It's a huge challenge.
It really forces us all to ponder what strategic independence truly looks like in a world where everyone expects you to pick a side. It makes you wonder, if a vast ocean can no longer act as a geographic fortress, what kind of shield can a country build out of pure diplomacy and supply chains?
It's a really critical thought.
Something to think about as the map of the world continues to change. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.